Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1726 London. The air smells of coal smoke, horse dung, and the Thames at low tide. Men in powdered wigs walk cobbled streets where anything can be bought for the right price, and some desires have to be buried so deep that only the bravest, or most desperate, dig them up. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud, because they could not. I'm Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In February 1726, in a cramped timber frame house on Field Lane in Holborn, a man named Gabriel Lawrence was pouring gin into chipped pewter cups, while 23 other men danced, kissed, and called each other by women's names. One man wore a calico gown. Another had rouged his cheeks with brick dust. A fiddler in the corner played something fast and reckless, and the whole room swayed with laughter and sweat, and the kind of joy that only exists when you know the constables could kick the door in at any moment. Gabriel called his establishment a molly house. The word molly was London slang for a man who desired other men, effeminate, foolish, inverted. An insult in the street, a badge of honor behind closed doors. That night, Gabriel had no idea he was about to become the most infamous molly housekeeper in English history, or that within 3 months, half the men in that room would be dead. To understand why, you have to understand something Georgian London believed about men like Gabriel, something most history books still refuse to say plainly. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you, but only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let's go back to Field Lane. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That's all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you'll know why a 40-year-old upholsterer named Thomas Norton betrayed everyone he loved, why a man called Princess Seraphina married another man in a mock chapel ceremony, and what the Society for the Reformation of Manners really did when they raided a molly house at dawn. Congratulations. You've just woken up in February 1726 in a city of 600,000 souls, and you are a molly. Good luck. The word feels strange in your mouth. Molly. It's what they call you in the streets when they want to hurt you. It's what the ballad sellers shout when they hawk their crude rhymes about men who dress as women and meet in secret. It's what the magistrates write in their ledgers when they send men to the pillory or the gallows. But in the houses, the molly houses, it's different. There, the word is warm. It's yours. You live in rented rooms near Charing Cross. You're a journeyman tailor, 26 years old, unmarried, and if anyone asks why you haven't taken a wife, you say you're saving money. Your mother stopped asking 2 years ago. Your father is dead. You have one sister, married, living in Suffolk, who doesn't write. You work 10 hours a day sewing waistcoats for gentlemen who will never learn your name. Your back aches. Your fingers are scarred with needle pricks. You eat bread and cheese most nights because meat is expensive and your wages are not. But on Thursdays, you go to Mother Clapp's. Mother Clapp's Molly House is the most famous in London, though famous is a dangerous word. Located in Field Lane, Holborn, a narrow, filthy street where the buildings lean toward each other like drunks, it's a public secret. Everyone knows. No one says. The house is owned by Margaret Clapp, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and sharper business sense. She's not a molly herself. She's married, she has children. But she knows opportunity when she sees it. Men need a place to meet. She provides it. For a fee, you arrive after dark. Always after dark. The door is plain wood, unmarked. You knock twice, pause, knock once more. A slot opens. Eyes appear. The door swings inward. The smell hits you first. Sweat and gin and tallow candles, and too many bodies in too small a space. The main room is maybe 15 feet across, low-ceilinged, wood-panelled, lit by candles stuck in bottles. There's a fireplace, but the fire is small, Coal costs money. The floor is uneven, the walls stained. And it is full of men, 30, maybe 40 men, packed shoulder to shoulder. Some are dressed as men, some are dressed as women, gowns, petticoats, caps, painted faces. Some are in between. A man in a leather apron and a lace cap. A man in breeches and a woman's shawl. They call each other by women's names. Orange Deb, Kitty Cambric, Princess Seraphina, Miss Sweetlips. The names are jokes and shields and identities all at once. Mother Clap herself, Margaret, sits near the fire, collecting coin, watching the room with the calm authority of a ship's captain. She doesn't smile much. She doesn't need to. The men love her anyway. She lets them exist. You pay your sixpence. She nods. You're in. Someone hands you a cup of gin. It tastes like juniper and regret, but it's warm, and after the first swallow, the fear in your chest starts to loosen. A man you've never seen before, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 30, with dark curls unpowdered, catches your eye from across the room. He's dressed as a man. He's smiling. You smile back. His name, you'll learn later, is Samuel. He's a coachman. He has a wife. He has 3 children. He comes to Mother Clap's every week anyway, because there are parts of himself that don't fit inside his marriage, and he stopped pretending they would. You talk. He buys you another gin. You stand too close, the way men don't stand in the street. His hand brushes yours. Once. Twice. Not an accident. In the corner of the room, 2 men are kissing. Openly. Deeply. No one is stopping them. No one is calling the constable. No one is shouting sodomite or Molly or dragging them into the street. This is what the Molly House is. Not just a place to meet, a place to stop pretending. Later, much later, you and Samuel will go upstairs. Mother Clap rents out small rooms on the upper floors. A shilling for an hour. The rooms are bare. A bed, a candle, a chamber pot. The walls are thin. You can hear the other men through the timber. Laughter, groans, whispered names. You will lie beside Samuel in the dark, his shoulder warm against yours, and feel something you've never felt before. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The knowledge that you are not the only man in London who feels this way. That there are rooms, hidden, rented, fragile, where you are allowed to be yourself. You will also feel afraid, because you know what happens to men like you when they're caught. Let me tell you about Thomas Newton. Thomas Newton is 40 years old in 1726. He's an upholsterer by trade, which means he stuffs furniture with horsehair and stitches fabric covers and gets paid poorly for it. He's thin, balding, with a drinker's red nose and the kind of face that looks older than it is. He's also a Molly. He's been going to the Molly houses for years. Mother Clap's, the 2 brewers in Pall Mall, Gabriel Lawrence's place in Field Lane, a half-dozen others. He knows everyone. He's friends with everyone. And in early 1726, Thomas Newton is arrested for theft. The details don't matter. He stole something, fabric maybe, or coin, and he was caught. The penalty for theft in Georgian England can be hanging, or transportation to the colonies, or a few months in Newgate prison. It depends on the magistrate's mood. Thomas Newton does not want to hang. He does not want to rot in Newgate. He does not want to be shipped to Virginia. So when the constables offer him a deal, he takes it. The deal is simple. Inform on the Mollies. Give us names, locations, evidence. Help us raid the Molly houses. Testify in court. Do this, and you walk free. Thomas Newton agrees. He is not the first Molly to turn informer. He won't be the last, but he will be the most successful. Over the next 2 months, Thomas Newton becomes the Society for the Reformation of Manners' most valuable weapon. The Society for the Reformation of Manners is exactly what it sounds like. A private organisation of middle-class Anglican men who believe England is drowning in sin and that they, personally, have been chosen by God to fix it. They fund constables. They pay informers. They organise raids on brothels, alehouses, and molly houses. They believe sodomy is a crime against God and nature. They believe mollies are spreading moral disease through London like the plague. They believe that if enough mollies are arrested, tried, and executed, the sin will stop. They are very, very wrong. But they are very, very determined. Thomas Newton goes back to the molly houses. He drinks with his friends. He laughs at their jokes. He kisses men in the back rooms. He learns their real names, their occupations, where they live. And then he writes it all down and hands the list to the constables. On the night of February 12th, 1726, the Society for the Reformation of Manners raids Mother Claps. They come at midnight, when the house is fullest. 40 men inside, maybe more. The constables kick the door open, swords drawn, lanterns high. The men scatter. Some try to run, some try to hide, under beds, in cupboards, behind the chimney. Some freeze. The constables arrest everyone they can grab. They arrest Mother Clap too, dragging her from her chair by the fire. She doesn't scream. She doesn't beg. She just stares at Thomas Newton, who is standing behind the constables with his hat in his hands, and she understands. 40 men are arrested that night. 40 men are dragged to the Guildhall and charged with sodomitical practices. Not all 40 will stand trial. Some will be released for lack of evidence. Some will bribe their way out. Some will die in Newgate before their trial date. But 3 men, William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, and Thomas Wright, will be tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Let me tell you about William Griffin first. William Griffin is 23 years old. He's a weaver. He has brown hair, grey eyes, and hands stained with indigo dye from the fabrics he works. He was born in Spitalfields, the son of Huguenot immigrants who fled France when Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes. His parents are dead. He has one older brother, also a weaver, who hasn't spoken to him in 2 years. William has been going to Mother Claps for 6 months. He's quiet there. He doesn't dress in women's clothes. He doesn't use a molly name. He just sits in the corner with a cup of gin and watches the others dance and wishes he were braver. On the night of the raid, he tries to hide under a bed. The constables find him anyway. At his trial in April 1726, Thomas Newton testifies that he saw William Griffin commit the act of sodomy with another man in one of Mother Clap's upstairs rooms. Newton describes the scene in graphic detail, where they were, what they were doing, what they said. William's lawyer argues that Newton is a liar and a criminal who will say anything to save himself. The jury doesn't care. William Griffin is convicted. He's sentenced to death by hanging. He's 23 years old. He'll be dead before his 24th birthday. Gabriel Lawrence, the man who ran his own molly house on Field Lane, is tried the same week. He's 41. He's married. He has 2 daughters. His wife, Anne, testifies in court that she had no idea what her husband was doing, that she thought the men coming to their house were just friends, that Gabriel told her they were a social club. The court doesn't believe her. Or maybe they do, and they just don't care. Thomas Newton testifies that Gabriel Lawrence not only ran a molly house, but participated in molly marriages, mock wedding ceremonies where 2 men stood before the group and exchanged vows while everyone cheered. Gabriel's lawyer argues that mock marriages are theatre, not crime, that no actual sodomy was committed, that running a house where men gather is not illegal. The prosecution argues that molly houses are conspiracy to commit sodomy, and conspiracy is enough. Gabriel Lawrence is convicted, sentenced to death. He has 2 daughters. They're 8 and 11. After the trial, his wife takes the girls and disappears into the London crowd. We don't know what happened to them. The records don't say. Thomas Wright is 56. He's a decorator. He's been going to molly houses for 30 years. He's one of the old guard, someone the younger mollies look up to, someone who remembers when the houses were even more hidden, even more dangerous. He's arrested at Mother Clap's. He doesn't try to run. He just sits on the floor with his back against the wall and waits for the constables to come get him. At trial, Thomas Newton testifies that Thomas Wright was one of the most active participants in the molly culture, that he dressed as a woman, called himself Miss Wright, and performed in the mock marriages as a bridesmaid. Wright's defense is simple. He's old, he's harmless, He's never hurt anyone, and the whole thing is just fun, theatre, play. The prosecution says Molly culture is a threat to England's moral fabric and must be exterminated. Thomas Wright is convicted, sentenced to death. He's 56 years old. He's spent 3 decades hiding who he is, finding stolen moments of joy in rented rooms, and now he's going to die for it. On May 9th, 1726, William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, and Thomas Wright are hanged at Tyburn. Tyburn is London's main execution ground, located where Marble Arch is today. It's a triangular wooden gallows that can hang 8 people at once. Executions are public spectacles. Thousands of people come to watch. On the day William, Gabriel, and Thomas are hanged, the crowd is especially large and especially hostile. Mollies are hated in Georgian London. Not just feared, hated. The crowd throws stones, rotting vegetables, dead animals. They scream sodomites and hellbound and worse. The ballad sellers work the crowd, selling crude rhyming sheets about the she-devils of Holborn. The 3 men are brought to the gallows in a cart. They're not bound, not yet. William Griffin is pale and silent. Gabriel Lawrence is praying. Thomas Wright is crying. The executioner places the nooses. The crowd roars. The cart is pulled away. Death by hanging in 1726 is not the quick drop and snap you see in movies. There's no trapdoor, no calculated fall to break the neck cleanly. The condemned are hanged by slow strangulation. They dangle, they kick, they choke. It takes minutes, sometimes longer. William Griffin dies first. His body goes limp after about 4 minutes. Gabriel Lawrence dies second, 6 minutes. Thomas Wright, the oldest, takes the longest, nearly 8 minutes. His body jerks and spasms while the crowd cheers. When it's over, their bodies are left hanging for an hour as a warning. Then they're cut down and buried in unmarked graves near the gallows. No one says a prayer for them. No one writes their names on a headstone. They vanish. Except they don't. Because we're saying their names right now. William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, Thomas Wright. They existed. They loved. They died. And they were not the only ones. The 1726 raids didn't stop at Mother Claps. Over the next 3 months, the Society for the Reformation of Manners, guided by Thomas Newton's information, raided a dozen molly houses across London, the 2 brewers in Pall Mall, the 3 tobacco pipes in Holborn, Gabriel Lawrence's place on Field Lane, John Cooper's house in Beech Lane, George Kedger's house in Little Suffolk Street. On and on. Hundreds of men were arrested. Most were released. Some were fined. Some were sentenced to the pillory, which in 1726 was nearly a death sentence in itself. The pillory was a wooden frame that locked a man's head and hands in place while he stood in a public square. He'd be there for an hour, sometimes longer, while the crowd threw whatever they wanted. Stones, bricks, dead cats, buckets of human waste. Men convicted of molly-related offences faced especially violent crowds. Several men died in the pillory from head injuries. Others were blinded. Others were simply beaten into unconsciousness and left to collapse when the constables finally unlocked the frame. The message was clear. London would tolerate prostitution, gambling, drunkenness, theft, but not this. Not men loving men. The raids worked in a way. The molly houses closed. The ones that survived went even deeper underground. The culture didn't die. It never does, but it learned to hide better. And Thomas Newton collected his reward. He was pardoned for his theft. He was paid by the Society for the Reformation of Manners. He walked free. We don't know what happened to him after 1726. The records go silent. He disappears. Some historians think he left London. Some think he changed his name. Some think the other Mollies, who now knew exactly who he was and what he'd done, found him in an alley one night and made sure he never informed again. I hope it was the last one. I hope they found him. But we don't know. History is full of gaps, and Thomas Newton slipped through one. Now let me take you inside a molly house on an ordinary night, before the raids, when men could still pretend the walls would hold. You arrive at Mother Clapp's on a Thursday in January 1726, 6 weeks before the raid that will destroy everything. You don't know that yet. Tonight, the house feels safe. You pay your sixpence to Margaret Clapp. She's seated in her usual spot by the fire, a ledger open on her lap. She's keeping track. Not names, she's too smart for that, but numbers. How many men? How much gin? How much rent from the upstairs rooms? This is a business, and Margaret Clapp runs it like one. She nods at you. You're a regular. She knows your face, if not your name. The room is already crowded. Maybe 30 men, and it's only 9 o'clock. By midnight, there will be 50. The fire is small, but the bodies make heat. You can smell sweat and cheap pomade and the gin that someone spilled on the floorboards last week. A man near the window is wearing a yellow gown. It's old, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, but he's belted it with a red sash and he's painted his lips with berry juice. He calls himself Kitty Cambric. His real name is John Blundell. He's a chairmaker, 29 years old, married with 1 child. You know this because you've talked to him before. In the Molly houses, men tell each other things they'd never say in daylight. John told you once, half drunk, that his wife thinks he works late on Thursdays. She thinks he's finishing chairs for a merchant in Cheapside. She has no idea. John doesn't feel guilty about the lie. He tried, he said. He tried to be the husband she wanted, but the wanting in him, it wouldn't go quiet. So now he comes here, and he wears a dress, and for a few hours, he gets to be Kitty, and that's enough to make the rest of the week bearable. Tonight, Kitty is dancing. There's a fiddler in the corner, a young man with dark skin and clever fingers, probably from the docks, probably paid in gin, and he's playing something fast. Kitty spins, laughing, and 2 other men join him. One is dressed as a shepherdess, complete with a wooden crook someone carved as a joke. The other is in plain breeches, but he's dancing like a woman anyway, hips swaying, hands high. You stand against the wall and watch. You're not brave enough to dance yet. Maybe later. Maybe after more gin. A man appears beside you. Not Samuel. You'll meet Samuel in 2 weeks. This man is older, maybe 45, with grey in his hair and a kind face. He's dressed plainly. Dark coat, no wig, scuffed boots. He looks like a clerk or a shopkeeper. His name is Edward Courtney. You don't know that yet. You will. He offers you his cup. You take a sip. It's gin, but better gin than what Margaret sells. He must have brought his own. You talk. Small things first. The cold. The price of coal. How crowded the streets were today. Then bigger things. How long have you been coming here? Do you live alone? Are you afraid? Yes, you tell him. You're afraid all the time. Edward nods. He understands. He's been coming to the Molly houses for 15 years. He remembers when there were only 2 or 3 in all of London. He remembers when Mother Clapp's was someone else's house, before Margaret took it over. He's seen men arrested. He's seen men hanged. But he keeps coming back. Because the fear of being alone, he says, is worse than the fear of being caught. You ask him if he thinks the houses are safe. He's quiet for a moment. Then he says no. He doesn't think they're safe. He thinks they're borrowed time. But borrowed time is still time, and he'll take what he can get. Across the room, 2 men are kissing against the wall. One has his hand in the other's hair. They're not hiding. They're not sneaking glances at the door. They're just kissing, slow and deep, the way men kiss women in the street after a wedding. Except men don't kiss men in the street. Not in 1726. Not ever. That's what the Molly House gives you. The ability to stop checking over your shoulder, even if it's just for an hour. Edward asks if you want to go upstairs. You say yes. The room costs a shilling. Edward pays. Margaret hands him a candle stub and points to the stairs. The upstairs hallway is narrow and dim. There are 5 doors, all closed. You can hear sounds behind them. A laugh, a groan, the creak of a bed frame. Edward opens the 3rd door. The room is barely bigger than a closet. A straw mattress on a wooden frame. A chamber pot in the corner. No window. The walls are thin timber, and you can hear the men in the next room. One of them is saying something soft. The words blurred, but the tone clear. Affection. Comfort. Edward closes the door. He sets the candle on the floor. The light flickers. You've done this before. A few times. But it still feels new. Still feels like crossing a line you can't uncross. Edward doesn't rush. He sits on the edge of the bed. He pats the space beside him. You sit. He asks if you're all right. You say yes. He takes your hand. His palm is rough, calloused. He's a baker, you'll learn later. He works in a shop near Drury Lane. He kneads dough for 10 hours a day, and his hands are scarred from the oven. You sit like that for a while, just holding hands. It's not sexual. Not yet. It's something else. Connection. Proof that you're not imagining this. That another man's hand can hold yours, and the world doesn't end. Eventually, you kiss. It's gentle, uncertain. You're not practiced at this. Neither is he, really. Men don't get to practice. You lie down on the narrow mattress. The straw crunches under you. The candle burns low. You can still hear the fiddle music downstairs, muffled through the floorboards. Edward touches your face. His thumb traces your jaw. He's looking at you like you matter. Like you're not just a body in a rented room. Like he sees you. You close your eyes. You let him kiss you. You let his hands pull you closer. This is what they'll call sodomy in court. This is what they'll say is a crime against God and nature. This moment, two men holding each other in the dark, careful and tender and afraid, this is what England wants to hang you for. You stay upstairs for an hour. When you come back down, the room is even more crowded. Someone has started singing. It's a bawdy song, something about a sailor and a merchant's wife, but the pronouns have been changed. Now it's a sailor and a merchant's son. Everyone knows the words. They sing along, loud and off-key and laughing. Margaret Clapp watches from her chair. She doesn't sing, but she's smiling, just a little. Near the fire, a man in a blue dress is arguing playfully with a man in a butcher's apron. The man in the dress is calling himself Princess Seraphina. His real name is James Orme. He's a wig maker, 32 years old. He's been coming to Mother Clapp's for 3 years. Tonight, Princess Seraphina has decided she's getting married. Molly marriages are a tradition in the houses. They're mock ceremonies, theatre, play, parody. Two men stand before the group and exchange vows while someone pretends to be a priest. Then everyone cheers and drinks and the whole thing dissolves into laughter. But they're also real. Not legally. Not in any way the church would recognize. But emotionally, they're real. They're a way for men to name what they feel. To stand in front of witnesses and say, this person matters to me. I choose him. Tonight, Princess Seraphina is marrying a man named Thomas. Thomas is younger, maybe 25, with red hair and freckles and a nervous smile. He's a printer's apprentice. He's only been to Mother Clapp's twice before. He looks terrified and thrilled in equal measure. Someone drapes a tablecloth over Seraphina's head, like a veil. Someone else produces a prayer book, stolen from a church probably. A man named George Whittle, who's done this before, stands at the front and clears his throat. The room goes quiet, not silent. You can still hear the fire crackling, someone coughing, the distant sound of a cart in the street, but quiet enough. George opens the prayer book. He's grinning. He begins. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of... He pauses. Someone shouts, Mother Clapp. Everyone laughs. George continues. In the sight of Mother Clapp and all present to join these two souls in matrimony. It's absurd. It's illegal. It's the bravest thing you've ever seen. Seraphina and Thomas hold hands. Seraphina is still grinning, playing it for laughs, but Thomas looks serious. His eyes are wet. George reads a bastardized version of the marriage liturgy. Do you take this man? Do you take this man? I do. I do. Someone shouts, "Kiss the bride," and Seraphina and Thomas kiss, and the room erupts in cheers. Margaret Clapp is still smiling. She's seen a dozen of these ceremonies. She knows they're not real, but she also knows they matter. She knows these men have nothing else. The party continues. More gin, more dancing. Someone tries to sing a hymn and gets shouted down because hymns are too risky. If a neighbour hears church music coming from Margaret's house at midnight, questions will be asked. You stay until nearly 2 in the morning. You're drunk. Not falling down drunk, but warm and loose and happy in a way you're never happy in daylight. Edward Courtney finds you before you leave. He asks if you'll come back next week. You say yes. He squeezes your hand once, quick, where no one can see. Then he's gone into the crowd. You step out into Field Lane. The cold hits you like a slap. The street is dark, except for a single lantern 2 houses down. The cobblestones are slick with something you don't want to identify. Somewhere nearby, a dog is barking. You walk home alone. It takes 30 minutes. You don't see a single constable, which is lucky. You're not sober enough to lie well. When you reach your rented room, you light a candle and sit on your bed. Your coat smells like smoke and gin and other men's sweat. You think about Edward's hand in yours. You think about Princess Seraphina in her tablecloth veil. You think about the way the whole room sang together. 50 men who had nothing in common except this one dangerous thing. You know it can't last. You know the city is full of men like Thomas Newton, men who would sell you for a pardon or a few coins. You know the Society for the Reformation of Manners is out there, watching, waiting, paying informers. But tonight you were not alone, and that has to be enough. Let me tell you about the other Molly houses. Because Mother Clapp's was famous, but it wasn't the only one. The Two Brewers in Pall Mall was run by a man named George Kedger. George was a publican. He owned the tavern legally, served regular customers during the day, and ran a Molly house upstairs at night. His setup was smarter than Margaret's in some ways. The downstairs was legitimate. If constables came, he could claim the men upstairs were just drunk friends staying late. It didn't save him. He was raided in March 1726, a month after Mother Clapp's. 15 men were arrested. George was tried, convicted, and sentenced to the pillory. He survived the pillory, barely. A brick hit him in the temple. He lost hearing in his left ear and walked with a limp afterward from the beating. But he lived. The 3 tobacco pipes in Holborn was smaller, rougher. It was run by a man named Jonathan Blaze, who was also a fence for stolen goods. The Molly House was a side business. His customers were mostly younger men, apprentices, labourers, soldiers, the kind of men who couldn't afford Mother Clapp's prices. Jonathan didn't get arrested in the 1726 raids. He heard about Mother Clapp's and closed his doors the next day. He left London entirely. No one knows where he went. John Cooper's Molly House in Beech Lane was the oldest in London. It had been operating since 1702. John himself was in his 60s by 1726, an old man by Georgian standards. He'd survived 24 years without getting caught. He was arrested in April 1726. The evidence against him was thin. No one had witnessed actual sodomy, and Thomas Newton had never been to Cooper's house. But the court didn't care. Running a Molly house was enough. John Cooper was sentenced to the pillory and 1 year in Newgate prison. He died in Newgate 3 months into his sentence. The cause of death was listed as jail fever, which was Georgian England's polite term for typhus. He was 67 years old. He'd spent a quarter century giving men a place to be themselves, and he died in a cell that smelled like human waste, surrounded by strangers, alone. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. His house in Beech Lane was sold to pay his debts. Everything he owned was auctioned off. No one attended his burial. It was too dangerous. If you showed up to mourn a Molly, you marked yourself as one. Now let me tell you what a Molly house sounded like. Because history preserves documents, trial transcripts, magistrate reports, letters, but it doesn't preserve sound, and sound is half the memory. The fiddle music was fast and repetitive, the kind of tune you could dance to even if you'd never been taught. The fiddler played the same melody over and over. A jig, probably, or a country dance tune everyone knew. He'd change key occasionally, shift tempo when the room got too rowdy, slow down when men started pairing off. The singing was terrible. 50 drunk men singing off-key in a room with bad acoustics, but it was joyful. That's the word that comes up in the trial transcripts, over and over. The men were joyful. The witnesses, constables, society informers, neighbours, couldn't understand it. They described the Molly houses as places of sin and degradation, but they also admitted, reluctantly, that the men seemed happy. Because they were. For a few stolen hours, they were happy. The laughter was loud, raucous, the kind of laughter that comes from relief as much as humour. Men laughed when someone told a joke. They laughed when someone tripped in a dress. They laughed when the gin ran out. They laughed because if they didn't laugh, they'd remember where they were and how fragile this all was. The conversations were quieter, murmured in corners. Two men standing close, voices low, heads bent together. You couldn't hear the words unless you were right next to them, but you could hear the tone, intimate, serious, sometimes sad. And underneath it all, the creak of the building, old timber settling, floorboards groaning under too much weight, the sound of 50 men trying to exist in a space built for 20. Margaret Clapp's house was always too full. Fire codes didn't exist in 1726, but if they had, she would have violated all of them. The main room was 15 by 20 feet maybe. 50 men in that space meant you were always touching someone. Shoulder to shoulder, back to chest. No personal space, but no one complained. Because the crowding was part of the safety. The more men there were, the harder it was for an informer to see everything. The harder it was to identify specific faces. The crowd was cover, until the constables came. Then the crowd was a trap. Let me tell you about a man named Samuel Stevens. Samuel was 19 years old in 1726. He was a tailor's apprentice, just like you. He lived with his master's family in Covent Garden. He'd been going to Mother Clapp's for 4 months. On the night of the raid, February 12th, 1726, Samuel was upstairs in one of the rented rooms with another man. They were just talking. That's what Samuel would say later in court, and I believe him, because not every moment in a Molly house was sexual. Sometimes men just wanted to talk to someone who understood. When the constables kicked the door in, Samuel tried to climb out a window. There was no window. He'd forgotten. Panic does that. The constables grabbed him. They dragged him downstairs. They threw him in the cart with 39 other men. At the Guildhall, Samuel gave his real name, his occupation, his address. He answered every question. He didn't lie. He thought honesty would save him. It didn't. He was charged with frequenting a Molly house. The penalty was a fine or the pillory. His master paid the fine, 10 shillings, because he didn't want the scandal of his apprentice in the pillory. But Samuel never went back to the tailor's shop. His master's family wouldn't let him in the house. They threw his belongings into the street. Samuel Stevens disappeared from the records after that. We don't know what happened to him. Maybe he found another apprenticeship. Maybe he left London. Maybe he died. He was 19. His whole life was in front of him, and one night at Mother Clapp's erased it. Now let me take you inside the trial of Margaret Clapp herself, because she was arrested the same night as the men, but her trial was different, stranger, more revealing. Margaret Clapp was charged with keeping a disorderly house, not with sodomy. She was a woman, and Georgian law didn't believe women could commit sodomy. Not with participating in Molly culture. Again, she was a woman. Just with running the establishment. The trial took place in July 1726, 5 months after the raid. By then, William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, and Thomas Wright were already dead. By then, the newspapers had spent months printing lurid descriptions of Molly houses, each more exaggerated than the last. By then, London was in a moral panic. Margaret stood in the dock at the Old Bailey. She was 46 years old. She wore a plain brown dress and a white cap. No jewelry. No powder. She looked like someone's mother, which she was. The prosecution called Thomas Newton first. Of course they did. Newton testified that he'd been to Margaret Clapp's house more than 20 times, that he'd seen men kissing, dancing, using women's names, that he'd seen men go upstairs to the rented rooms and come back down dishevelled, that Margaret knew exactly what was happening under her roof and profited from it. Margaret's lawyer, a young man named Edmund Ward, who was probably doing this as a favour to someone, tried to argue that Margaret was simply running a lodging house, that what the men did upstairs was their business, not hers, that she couldn't be held responsible for her tenants' private behaviour. The prosecution laughed. Actually laughed in court. They called more witnesses. A constable who'd been in the raid described finding two men in bed together in one of Margaret's upstairs rooms. He described, in clinical detail, their state of undress and the position they were in when the door was kicked open. They called a neighbour, a woman named Elizabeth Carter, who testified that she'd seen dozens of men coming and going from Margaret's house at all hours. That the neighbourhood knew what it was. That respectable people crossed the street to avoid walking past it. They called Samuel Stevens, not the 19-year-old apprentice, a different Samuel Stevens, a baker, who testified that he'd delivered bread to Margaret's house every Friday for 2 years, that he'd seen men in dresses, that one time a man had answered the door wearing rouge and called himself Miss Fanny. Margaret didn't testify in her own defence. Women rarely did in 1726. Her lawyer called 2 character witnesses, a shopkeeper who said Margaret was honest in her business dealings, and a midwife who'd attended Margaret during the birth of her youngest child and said she was a good mother. The jury deliberated for 11 minutes. Guilty. Margaret Clapp was sentenced to stand in the pillory, pay a fine of £20 and serve 2 years in Newgate Prison. The pillory took place 3 days later in Smithfield Market. The crowd was enormous. Thousands of people. They'd come to see the woman who ran the Molly House. The things they threw at her weren't just vegetables and stones. Someone threw a dead rat. Someone threw a bucket of blood, pig's blood probably, from a nearby butcher's stall. Someone threw human excrement. Margaret stood, locked in the wooden frame for 2 hours. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood there, blood and filth running down her face, while London expressed its moral outrage. When the constables finally unlocked her, she couldn't walk. They had to carry her to the cart that would take her to Newgate. She served 18 months of her 2-year sentence. Then she was released on account of ill health. The prison records say she had a persistent cough and recurring fever, probably tuberculosis. She left London after her release. Some historians think she went north, maybe to York or Newcastle. Others think she went to Ireland. One historian, digging through parish records in the 1990s, found a Margaret Clapp buried in a churchyard in Bristol in 1734. The age matches. The date matches. If it's her, and it probably is, then she lived 8 more years after the trial. She survived. But her house didn't. After the raid, Field Lane became synonymous with molly culture. No one would rent the building. It sat empty for 3 years, then burned down in a fire in 1729. Probably arson. Probably someone who thought they were doing God's work. The spot where Mother Clapp stood is now covered by a modern office building. There's no plaque, no marker. Nothing to say that this was once a place where men could hold hands without fear. But we know. And that's something. Now let me tell you about the language of the Molly houses. Because the Mollys didn't just create a space, they created a dialect. Molly itself was the foundational word. It meant effeminate man, sodomite, a man who desired men. It was an insult everywhere else. In the houses, it was neutral, factual. I'm a Molly. You're a Molly. We're all Mollys here. The women's names were part armour, part identity, part joke. Men took names like Kitty, Prudence, Mary, Susan, Orange Deb, Miss Sweetlips, Princess Seraphina. Some names were aspirational, princess, duchess, lady. Some were descriptive, Ginger Nan if you had red hair, Long Bess if you were tall. Some were just pretty. The names served multiple purposes. They provided a layer of deniability. If someone overheard Kitty kissed Prudence, it sounded like women, not men. They allowed men to try on a different identity, to be someone other than the apprentice or the shopkeeper or the husband. And they created intimacy. When you told someone your Molly name, you were trusting them with something real. Marriage and wedding were words the Mollys used seriously. A Molly marriage wasn't legally binding, but it was emotionally binding. When two men stood before witnesses and exchanged vows, they were making a promise. Sometimes the marriage lasted one night, sometimes it lasted years. The houses kept track, not on paper, too dangerous, but in collective memory. If you were married to someone at Motherclaps, everyone knew. If you showed up the next week with a different man, there would be teasing. Molly divorce was also a thing, complete with mock-serious accusations of infidelity and property disputes over imaginary dowries. It was all theatre, but it was also real. The line between performance and sincerity was thin, and the Mollys walked it constantly. Husband and wife were used without irony. The man who took the more masculine role in a relationship might be called the husband, the more feminine, the wife. But the roles were fluid. A man could be a husband on Thursday and a wife on Saturday. No one cared. The point wasn't rigid gender roles. It was finding language for relationships that the outside world refused to acknowledge existed. Trade was a word with a specific meaning. It referred to a man who didn't identify as a Molly, but who had sex with men anyway. Usually working-class men, soldiers, sailors, labourers, who'd go to Molly houses for money or drinks, or just because they were lonely. The Mollys were fascinated by trade. They wrote about them, gossiped about them, pursued them. Trade was masculine in a way the Mollys often weren't. Trade was dangerous and thrilling, and often broke your heart. Coming out had a completely different meaning in 1726. It didn't mean revealing your identity to the world. It meant going to a Molly house for the first time. He's just come out. He's new. Be gentle. It was an initiation, a threshold, the moment you stopped being alone. Dropping hairpins was code for being obviously, flamboyantly Molly. If a man walked with a swish, spoke with affectation, wore his clothes a little too tight, he was dropping hairpins. It was visible queerness. Risky in the street, celebrated in the houses. The trade entrance and the back room were physical spaces, but also metaphorical ones. The trade entrance was the side door where men who didn't want to be seen could slip in. The back room was where the more explicitly sexual activity happened, as opposed to the main room, which was for socializing. But the language wasn't just functional, it was playful. The Mollys were funny. The trial transcripts, dry, legal, hostile, still capture flashes of humour. A constable testifying that he heard a man say, "I'm the Queen of England, darling, and you'll address me properly." A witness reporting that two men were arguing about whose turn it was to be the bride because I was the bride last week and my knees still hurt. Gallows humour maybe, but humour nonetheless. Let me tell you about a man named James Oviatt. James was 28 in 1726. He worked as a servant in a household in Westminster. He'd been going to Molly houses for 5 years, not just Motherclaps but several others. He was part of the core community. James used the name Lady Oviatt in the houses. He wore dresses sometimes, but not always. He liked dancing. He had a boyfriend, a man named William, a shoemaker, who used the name Duchess. They'd been together for 2 years. They weren't married in a Molly ceremony, but they might as well have been. Everyone knew they were a couple. On the night Motherclaps was raided, James wasn't there. He'd stayed home with a cold. William was there. William was arrested. James found out the next morning. A friend came to the servants' entrance of the Westminster House and told him. James left work immediately. He went to the Guildhall. He tried to see William. They wouldn't let him in. He wasn't family. He wasn't a lawyer. He was nobody. William was released 3 days later. The evidence against him was thin. He'd been in the main room, not upstairs, and Thomas Newton hadn't mentioned him by name, but his employer fired him the day he got out. Someone had told the employer where William had been arrested, a Molly house. That was enough. James and William left London together in March 1726. They went to Bristol. We know this because James wrote a letter to another Molly, a man named Charles Benson, who saved it. The letter was discovered in the 1950s in a collection of 18th century papers bought at auction by a university library. A historian found it while researching something else entirely. The letter is 4 pages long. James describes the journey to Bristol, 3 days on foot because they couldn't afford the coach. He describes finding work, James as a footman again, William in a cobbler's shop. He describes their lodgings, a single rented room with a lumpy mattress and a cracked window. And then he writes this, and I'm going to quote it in full because it's one of the very few surviving pieces of writing by a Molly, in his own words. "We are safer here than we were in London, though safety is a relative term. We do not go to houses as we once did. There are none here, or if there are, we have not found them. But we have each other, and that is enough." William says he would rather live in a single room with me than in a palace alone, and I believe him because I feel the same. We are careful. We do not touch in the street. We do not speak of what we are to our neighbours. But at night, when the door is locked and the candle is lit, we are ourselves. That is all I ever wanted. To be myself with someone who sees me. London took that from us, but it could not take us from each other. I count that as a victory. James Oviatt and William the shoemaker, we don't have William's last name, lived together in Bristol until at least 1730. After that, the records go silent. We don't know if they died, moved again, or simply faded into the anonymity they were trying so hard to maintain. But they had 4 years. 4 years of being themselves behind a locked door. 4 years that London tried to take from them and failed. I think about that letter a lot. I think about James writing it by candlelight, carefully, knowing it was dangerous to put these words on paper, but needing to say them anyway. I think about Charles Benson keeping it for decades, hidden somewhere safe. I think about the historian who found it in 1953 and realized what it was. History is full of silence. But sometimes a voice breaks through. Now let me tell you what happened to the men who were arrested at Mother Clapp's, but not executed, because William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, and Thomas Wright were the ones who hanged, but they weren't the only ones who suffered. 40 men were arrested that night in February. 3 were executed. Margaret Clapp went to prison. That leaves 36 men. 12 were released almost immediately for lack of evidence. They'd been in the main room, not upstairs. They hadn't been witnessed doing anything explicitly sexual. Thomas Newton hadn't mentioned them in his testimony. They were lucky, but their names were recorded. The Guildhall kept a ledger. Name, age, occupation, address. Those ledgers were public record. Anyone could read them. Some of those 12 men lost their jobs. Some lost their homes. Some left London. One, a man named Richard Southwell, a chandler's assistant, hanged himself 2 weeks after his release. He left no note. His landlord found him dangling from a ceiling beam. 8 men were fined. The fines ranged from 5 shillings to £2, depending on what the magistrate thought you could afford. If you couldn't pay, you went to debtor's prison until someone paid for you or you rotted. Most of the 8 paid. One didn't. His name was Henry Ward. He spent 6 months in debtor's prison. He got out in August 1726, walked to the docks, and took a ship to Virginia as an indentured servant. 7 years of labour in exchange for passage. He never came back. 16 men were sentenced to the pillory. The pillory was held in stages. You couldn't fit 16 men in the frame at once, so they did it in groups of 4. Each group stood for an hour. The first group went up on March 3, 1726, in Smithfield Market. The crowd was waiting. They'd known this was coming. The newspapers had printed the schedule. The first man locked in the frame was named David Crane. He was a watchmaker, 34 years old. He'd been going to Mother Claps for 6 months. The crowd threw stones, big ones, cobblestones pried up from the street. One hit David in the face. It broke his nose. Blood poured down his chin, onto his shirt, onto the wooden frame. The constables didn't stop the crowd. Technically, they were supposed to. Technically, the pillory was meant to be humiliation, not execution. But for Molly's, the rules were different. David Crane survived his hour. Barely. When they unlocked him, he collapsed. They threw a bucket of water on him to wake him up. Then they dragged him aside to make room for the next group. The second group included a man named Peter Bavidge. Peter was young, maybe 22. He was a printer's assistant. He'd only been to Mother Claps 3 times. The crowd threw dead animals at Peter. A dead cat, rotting, crawling with maggots. It hit him in the chest. He vomited. The crowd laughed. Someone threw a rock. It missed Peter and hit the man next to him, a carpenter named William Eaton. The rock struck William in the temple. He went limp in the frame, unconscious or dead. The crowd couldn't tell and didn't care. William Eaton was alive, it turned out, but the blow fractured his skull. He lived for 3 more weeks in a charity hospital, delirious and in pain, before he died on March 24th. He was 39 years old. He had a wife who didn't know where he'd been arrested until after he was dead. She came to the hospital when she finally tracked him down. She stood by his bed and wept. Not for the man he was. She hadn't known that man, but for the man she thought he was. The man who'd lied to her every week for 3 years so he could go to a house on Field Lane and be himself. The third group went up at noon. By then, the crowd was drunk. Smithfield Market had taverns on every corner, and enterprising publicans were selling pints to the crowd at inflated prices. Moral outrage was thirsty work. A man named Charles Fassam was in the third group. Charles was 51. He was a tailor. He'd been married twice. Both wives dead, one in childbirth, one from smallpox. He had no children. He'd been going to molly houses for 20 years. The crowd threw shit at Charles. Human shit, collected from chamber pots and sold by enterprising children for a penny a bucket. It hit him full in the face. He couldn't wipe it away. His hands were locked in the frame. He just stood there, shit dripping from his hair, his face, his mouth. He survived, but he never worked again. No one would hire a molly. He died in a workhouse in 1729, 3 years later, from pneumonia. The workhouse buried him in a mass grave. No marker, no name. The fourth group was the last. By then, it was late afternoon. The crowd had thinned. The ones who remained were the hardcore, the people who wanted to see blood. A man named Jonathan Sidebottom was in the fourth group. Jonathan was the youngest, only 20. He was a servant in a household in Covent Garden. His employer was a wealthy merchant who didn't know where his footman went on his days off. The crowd threw bricks at Jonathan. One hit him in the stomach. He doubled over as much as the frame would allow, gasping for air. A woman in the crowd, someone later identified her as Alice Pruitt, a washerwoman, climbed up onto the platform where the pillory stood. She spat in Jonathan's face. Then she grabbed his hair and slammed his head against the wooden frame. Once, twice, 3 times. The constables pulled her off, but the damage was done. Jonathan's head was bleeding. His eyes were unfocused. He survived the hour. He was released. He walked away from Smithfield Market and disappeared into the city. His employer fired him a week later. Not because he knew about the molly house. He didn't. But because Jonathan couldn't work anymore. The blows to his head had done something. He couldn't remember things. He couldn't follow instructions. He'd stand in the middle of a room and forget why he was there. The merchant was kind, in his way. He gave Jonathan 2 weeks' wages and a reference letter that said Jonathan was letting go due to ill health. Then, he sent him away. Jonathan Sidebottom died 6 months later. The parish register lists cause of death as fits, probably epilepsy triggered by brain damage. He was 20 years old. 16 men went into the pillory. 14 came out alive. All 16 were destroyed. Now let me tell you about the men who weren't at Motherclaps the night of the raid, but whose lives changed anyway. Because the 1726 panic didn't stop at Field Lane. It spread. After the arrests, the Society for the Reformation of Manners published a pamphlet. It was called The Sodomite's Confession, or The Warning Voice of the Gallows. It cost 2 pence and sold thousands of copies. It listed the names of every man arrested in the Molly House raids. All of them. Even the ones who were released. Even the ones who were never charged. Your name, the name of the tailor from Charing Cross, was on that list. You weren't arrested. You hadn't been to Motherclaps in 3 weeks. You were at home, in your rented room, sewing buttons onto a gentleman's waistcoat when the raid happened. You didn't know anything had happened until 2 days later, when your landlord knocked on your door and told you to leave. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Someone had shown him the pamphlet. Someone had pointed to your name. You had a week to find new lodgings. You tried. You went to every boarding house in Charing Cross, then St. Giles, then Clerkenwell. No one would take you. Word spread faster than you could walk. You ended up in a cellar room in Shoreditch. It was damp and cold, and the ceiling was so low you couldn't stand up straight. It cost 3 shillings a week, which was robbery, but the landlord didn't care that your name was in the pamphlet. He just cared that you could pay. Your employer, the tailor you'd been apprenticed to for 6 years, let you go. He said business was slow. He said he couldn't afford to keep you on. He wouldn't look you in the eye when he said it. You knew the real reason. One of his clients had seen the pamphlet. The client had told him that if he kept employing a Molly, he'd lose their business. The tailor had a family to feed. You understood. Understanding didn't make it hurt less. You found work eventually. Piecework, paid by the garment, stitching in your cellar room by candlelight. The pay was 1/3 of what you'd earned before. Your hands cramped, your eyes strained. You could barely afford food. You didn't go back to the Molly houses. You couldn't risk it. Every house in London was being watched now. Constables, informers, neighbours with grudges. You were 26 years old and you were alone. Edward Courtney, the baker you'd met at Motherclaps, the man who'd held your hand in the upstairs room, found you 3 months after the raid. You didn't know how he found you. Later, he told you he'd asked around. Quietly, carefully. He'd heard you'd been evicted. He'd heard you were in Shoreditch. He'd walked through the neighbourhood, knocking on doors, until someone pointed him to your cellar. When you opened the door and saw him standing there, you almost didn't recognise him. He'd lost weight. His face was grey. He looked 10 years older. He asked if he could come in. You let him. He sat on the edge of your bed, a straw mattress on the floor, the only furniture you had, and told you what had happened to him. He'd been at Motherclaps the night of the raid. He'd been in the main room, near the fire, talking to Princess Seraphina. When the constables came, he tried to run. He made it out the back door, into the alley, before someone grabbed him. Not a constable. Another Molly. A man Edward had known for years, a man named William Fox, who was also trying to escape. They ran together. They didn't get far. The alley was a dead end. The constables caught them. They dragged them both back to the house. They arrested them both. Edward was charged with frequenting a Molly house. He was sentenced to a fine and the pillory. He paid the fine, £5, nearly everything he'd saved. He thought the fine would spare him the pillory. It didn't. He stood in the pillory anyway. 1 hour in Smithfield Market on a cold March morning. The crowd was smaller for Edward's group. Only a few hundred people instead of thousands. But they were just as vicious. Someone threw a bottle. It shattered against the wooden frame inches from Edward's head. Glass cut his cheek. He still had the scar. Edward survived. He went home. His wife was waiting. She knew. Someone had told her. A neighbour, probably. She'd known for weeks and hadn't said anything. She told him to leave. Not angrily, not cruelly. Just quietly, with the kind of exhausted sadness that comes from realizing your entire marriage was built on a lie. Edward left. He took his clothes and his tools, and he left. He'd been sleeping in the bakehouse where he worked, curled up by the ovens at night. His employer, an older man, a widower, hadn't asked questions. Edward worked twice as hard as before, showed up earlier, stayed later. The employer let him stay. Edward told you all this in a flat, empty voice. Then he stopped talking. You sat beside him. Your shoulder touched his. You didn't say anything. What was there to say? Eventually, Edward asked if he could stay for a while. Not permanently, just a few hours. He was tired of sleeping alone. You said yes. He lay down on your mattress. You lay down beside him. The cellar was cold and damp, and the ceiling was too low, and the street noise filtered through the walls. But Edward's warmth was real. His breathing was steady. For the first time in 3 months, you didn't feel alone. You didn't have sex. You didn't even kiss. You just lay there, shoulder to shoulder, while the afternoon light faded and the cellar darkened. Edward left before full dark. Too dangerous to be seen leaving another man's lodgings at night. He came back the next week, and the next, and the next. It wasn't a relationship, not the way you'd imagined relationships could be. There were no dates, no public dinners, no walks in the park, just stolen hours in a cellar in Shoreditch, lying side by side, pretending the world outside didn't exist. It was enough. It had to be. Let me tell you about the trials that happened after the big names, because the executions and the pillories made the newspapers, but there were dozens of smaller cases, quieter destructions. In May 1726, a man named Robert Morris was arrested for soliciting another man on London Bridge. There was no Molly House involved, no Thomas Newton, just Robert, drunk, propositioning a stranger who turned out to be an off-duty constable. Robert was tried and convicted of attempted sodomy. The penalty was the pillory and 6 months in Newgate. He served 4 months. He died in Newgate in September from dysentery. He was 33 years old. He'd been a clerk for a shipping company. He had a mother who loved him and a sister who visited him once in prison and then never came back. In June 1726, 2 men, George White and Stephen Jones, were arrested in a rented room in Southwark. The landlord had heard noises. He'd kicked the door open. He'd seen them in bed together. The landlord called the constables. The constables arrested both men. George and Stephen had been lovers for 3 years. They'd met at a Molly House, not Mother Clapp's, one of the smaller ones in Southwark that was never raided. They'd fallen in love. They'd moved in together. They'd told the landlord they were cousins. At trial, the prosecution argued that cohabitation proved intent to commit sodomy. The defence argued that 2 men sharing lodgings to save money wasn't a crime. The jury sided with the prosecution. George White and Stephen Jones were both sentenced to the pillory and 2 years in prison. They were pilloried on the same day, locked in the frame side by side. The crowd threw stones. A rock hit Stephen in the head. He died 3 days later from a brain hemorrhage. He was 28. George White served his 2 years. He got out in 1728. He left London. A parish register in Norwich records the burial of a George White, aged 31, in 1731. It might be him. Probably is. If it is, he lived 3 years after Stephen died, 3 years alone. In August 1726, a man named Henry Davis was arrested for wearing women's clothing in public. He'd been walking down Cheapside in a dress and bonnet, drunk, singing. Someone called the constables. Henry wasn't a Molly. Or maybe he was. The trial transcripts are unclear. He told the court he'd lost a bet and the forfeit was wearing a dress for a day. He said it was a joke. The prosecution said it was Molly behaviour and that Molly behaviour was evidence of sodomy. Henry was convicted. Pillory and a fine. He survived the pillory. Barely. Someone threw a cobblestone that hit him in the ribs. He walked away with 3 broken ribs and a collapsed lung. He paid the fine. He left London. We don't know where he went. The thing about moral panics is that they eat everything in their path. Guilty, innocent, somewhere in between. Doesn't matter. If you look like the thing they're afraid of, you're guilty enough. Now let me tell you about the women. Because Molly houses weren't exclusively male spaces. There were women there too. Not many, but some. Margaret Clapp, obviously. But also other women. Women who worked as servants, bringing gin and food. Women who rented out their houses for Molly gatherings. Women who were friends with the Mollys, who knew what the houses were and didn't care. And women who were Mollys themselves. Sort of. The word Molly was gendered male, but gender in the Molly houses was fluid in ways Georgian England didn't have language for. There were men who lived as women full-time, not just in the houses. And there were women, born female, who desired other women and found safety in Molly spaces because there was nowhere else to go. Let me tell you about a woman named Anne Marrow. The trial transcripts call her a female husband. That was the legal term for a woman who lived as a man and married another woman. Anne wasn't arrested in the 1726 raids. She was arrested 2 years later, in 1728, in a separate case. But her story intersects with the Molly houses. Anne was born female in 1695. She was raised as a girl, but by the time she was 20, she was living as a man. She wore men's clothes. She used a man's name, George. She worked as a labourer, doing jobs women weren't allowed to do. And she married a woman, Mary Cooper. The marriage wasn't legal. Women couldn't legally marry each other, but they went through a ceremony anyway. A minister performed it. He thought George was a man. So did Mary at first. Mary found out the truth on their wedding night. The trial transcripts describe her reaction as shock and distress, but they also note that Mary didn't leave. She stayed. They lived together as husband and wife for 3 years. They were arrested in 1728 when a neighbour grew suspicious. The neighbour reported them to the authorities. The authorities examined Anne's body to confirm her sex. Then they arrested her for fraud. Anne was tried and convicted. The charge was fraud and deception. The sentence was the pillory and 6 months in Bridewell prison. At trial, Anne's lawyer argued that she'd never deceived Mary, that Mary had known the truth and stayed willingly. The prosecution argued that a woman pretending to be a man was inherently deceptive and corrupting. The jury believed the prosecution. Anne stood in the pillory in May 1728. The crowd was brutal. They called her a monster. They threw stones and dead animals and filth. Someone threw a brick that shattered her collarbone. She survived. She served her 6 months. She got out in November 1728. And then she disappeared. No death record. No further arrests. No trace. Some historians think she left England entirely. Others think she changed her name again and went back to living as a man somewhere no one knew her. Others think she didn't survive long after prison, that the injuries from the pillory or the conditions in Bridewell killed her slowly. We don't know, but what we do know is that Anne Marrow found her way to Molly spaces before her arrest. The trial transcripts mention that she and Mary were seen at a house in Southwark, frequented by Mollys and women of similar inclinations. The transcripts don't name the house, but it was there. The Molly houses weren't perfect. They were male-dominated. They were focused on male desire. But they were also the only spaces in Georgian London where gender could be fluid, where women who loved women could exist without immediate persecution, where the categories man and woman could be questioned. Anne Marrow wasn't alone. There were other female husbands, other women in men's clothing, other women at the edges of Molly culture, finding what safety they could. History barely remembers them. The records are thin, but they were there. Now let me tell you what the Molly houses looked like in physical detail, because I've described the people and the culture, but not the actual rooms. And the rooms mattered. Mother Clapp's house on Field Lane was a standard London townhouse, 3 stories tall, narrow and deep. The ground floor had 2 rooms, the main room where the men gathered, and a back room that served as a kitchen and storage. The main room had a fireplace, essential for heat in the winter. The walls were wood-panelled, dark with age and smoke. The floor was wide planks, uneven, creaking under weight. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet. Taller men had to duck under the beams. The windows were small, covered with shutters at night to keep out prying eyes. During the gatherings, the shutters were always closed. The furniture was minimal, a few benches along the walls, a table near the fire where Margaret sat. No chairs. Chairs were expensive and took up too much room. Most men stood or sat on the floor. The lighting was candles, dozens of them, stuck in bottles, in wall sconces, on the mantelpiece. Tallow candles, which smelled of rendered animal fat and smoking wicks. The room was always dim, always flickering. You couldn't see clearly from one side to the other. The upstairs had 5 small rooms. Each room was maybe 8 feet by 6 feet. A bed, just a wooden frame with a straw mattress. No sheets, or if there were sheets, they weren't clean. A chamber pot, sometimes a single chair. That was it. The walls between the rooms were thin, just planks with gaps. You could hear everything happening in the next room. Voices, movement, breathing. The stairs were narrow and steep, the kind of stairs where you had to turn sideways and watch your step. During the raid, men fell trying to run up those stairs. One man, his name was lost, the records just say, a young man, broke his ankle on the stairs trying to escape. The constables arrested him anyway. The attic was used for storage. Barrels of gin, sacks of grain, broken furniture. No one went up there during the gatherings except Margaret when she needed to restock. The cellar was where Margaret kept the extra gin and the beer. It was also where men sometimes went, if all the upstairs rooms were occupied. The cellar was darker, colder, damper, but it was private. The back door opened onto an alley. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. It was unpaved, just dirt and stones and whatever garbage people had thrown out. The alley connected Field Lane to the next street over. It was the escape route, until the night of the raid, when constables blocked both ends. The house smelled like sweat, and gin, and smoke, and too many bodies. It smelled like tallow and damp wood, and the Thames, which was only a few streets away. It smelled like men who worked all day and couldn't afford to bathe regularly. It smelled human. The other Molly houses were similar. The Two Brewers was larger. It was a functioning tavern, but the upstairs layout was the same. Small rooms, thin walls, narrow stairs. John Cooper's house in Beach Lane was older and even more cramped. The ceilings were lower, the rooms were smaller, but it had been operating for 24 years, so clearly it worked. The Molly houses weren't glamorous, they weren't safe, they were cramped, dark, smelly, illegal spaces where men took enormous risks just to exist for a few hours. But they were also full of laughter and music and joy. They were places where men called each other by chosen names and held hands and kissed without fear. They were places where you could be yourself, and that was worth everything. Let me tell you about the Society for the Reformation of Manners, because they're the ones who destroyed the Molly houses, and they deserve to be named. The Society was founded in 1691. It was a private organisation funded by wealthy Anglican merchants and professionals. Their stated goal was to reform public morals, to reduce drunkenness, prostitution, blasphemy, and sodomy. They operated by funding constables and informers. They paid men like Thomas Newton to infiltrate vice dens and report back. They organised raids. They brought prosecutions. They published pamphlets naming and shaming the arrested. By 1726, the Society had been operating for 35 years. They'd successfully shut down hundreds of brothels and alehouses, but Molly houses were their particular obsession. The Society believed sodomy was England's greatest sin. They believed it would bring divine punishment, plague, famine, military defeat. They believed that if they could eliminate the Mollys, they could save the nation's soul. They were funded by men like Sir John Gonson, a magistrate and member of Parliament. Gonson personally oversaw many of the Molly House raids. He attended the trials. He made sure the sentences were harsh. They were funded by men like Samuel Wesley, a clergyman and father of John Wesley, who would later found Methodism. Samuel Wesley wrote sermons about the Molly menace. He called sodomy the sin that dare not be named, and then proceeded to name it repeatedly. They were funded by men whose names we don't know because they donated anonymously. Respectable men, married men, men who maybe had their own secrets and overcompensated with public outrage. The society kept meticulous records. They recorded every raid, every arrest, every conviction. They published annual reports listing their successes. The 1726 report noted with pride that they had prosecuted and convicted 43 sodomites and molly housekeepers, resulting in 3 executions, 16 pillories, and numerous imprisonments. They treated it like a scorecard. The Society for the Reformation of Manners existed until 1738. It disbanded after internal disputes about funding and strategy. But the damage was done. The molly houses never recovered. Oh, they continued to exist. Gay men have always found ways to meet, but never again as openly as they had before 1726. The culture went underground, deeper, quieter, more afraid. The society believed they'd won. In a way they had. But let me tell you what the Society for the Reformation of Manners didn't destroy. They didn't destroy the letters. Men wrote letters to each other, love letters, desperate letters, letters arranging meetings, letters remembering nights at the molly houses, letters that said things that could never be said aloud. Most of those letters were burned. The men who received them knew better than to keep evidence. But some survived, hidden in walls, sewn into coat linings, buried in trunks and forgotten for 200 years. In 1998, a researcher named Rictor Norton published a collection of these letters. He'd spent decades tracking them down in archives, private collections, estate sales. Some were fragmentary, some were complete. All were devastating. Let me read you one. It was written in March 1726, a month after the Mother Claps raid, by a man whose name was redacted from the archive record. The recipient's name was also redacted. But the letter survived. My dear friend, I write to you in haste and in fear. The houses are all closed. The men are all arrested or fled. I do not know where you are or if you are safe. I heard that you were at C's house the night of the raid, but I do not know if you were taken. I have been to the Guildhall, but they will not tell me the names of the arrested unless I am family. I am not family. I am nothing to you in the eyes of the law. I am writing to the last address I had for you and praying this reaches you. If you are reading this, you are alive. That is enough. I do not expect you to write back. It is too dangerous. But know that I think of you. Know that the nights we had were real. Know that I would have spent a lifetime with you if the world had allowed it. They have taken everything else from us. Do not let them take the memory, yours, in grief and in hope. The letter was never sent. It was found folded in a Bible that was sold at auction in 1823. Someone kept it for 100 years. Maybe the man who wrote it. Maybe the man it was meant for. Maybe someone else who understood what it meant to love in secret. The Bible ended up in a university library. The letter was discovered in 1952 by a cataloger who almost threw it away because it wasn't relevant to biblical scholarship. But she read it, and she kept it, and eventually it made its way to Rictor Norton, who published it, and now you and I are reading it in 2024. That man, whoever he was, he wanted his love to be remembered, and it is. Now let me tell you about the molly house that wasn't raided, because not all of them were caught. There was a house in Spitalfields run by a man named Benjamin Griffin, not William Griffin, who was executed. Different man, same surname. Benjamin was older, smarter, more careful. Benjamin's house didn't advertise. You couldn't just show up. You had to be invited by someone who was already part of the circle. New men were vetted. If you seemed risky, too loud, too drunk, too likely to inform, you weren't invited back. Benjamin charged more than Mother Claps. A shilling just to enter, and another shilling if you wanted to use one of the upstairs rooms. The higher price kept out the desperate and the reckless. It also meant Benjamin could afford to bribe the local constables. Because that's how Benjamin's house survived. He paid the constables. Not a lot, a few shillings a week, sometimes a bottle of gin. Just enough that when the Society for the Reformation of Manners came asking questions, the constables said they'd never heard of any molly activity in that part of Spitalfields. Benjamin's house operated from 1723 to 1731. 8 years. In that time, it was never raided once. We know about it because one of Benjamin's regular customers, a man named Ralph Thornton, kept a diary. Ralph was a clerk for the East India Company. He was educated, wealthy enough, and careful. His diary wasn't discovered until 1978, when his great-great-great-grandson donated a box of family papers to a local historical society. Ralph's diary is matter-of-fact about the Molly House. He writes about it the way other men write about going to a coffee house. February 14th, 1727. Went to B's house in the evening, spoke with T about the new trade routes, danced with a soldier whose name I did not ask. Home by midnight. March 3rd, 1727. B's house very crowded. A new man arrived, Italian I think, very handsome. Did not speak to him. Stayed late, regretted it this morning. Ralph went to Benjamin's house almost every week for 4 years. The diary records dozens of visits. He describes the other men, some by name, some by description. He describes the conversations, the gossip, the relationships forming and dissolving, and he describes the fear. April 10th, 1727. Heard news today that another house was raided in Southwark. 3 men arrested. I do not know their names, but I fear I knew their faces. Every time I hear of a raid, I wonder if ours will be next, and yet I keep going. I cannot stop. To stop would be to live half a life, and I cannot bear it. Ralph stopped going to Benjamin's house in 1731, not because it was raided, it never was, but because he got married. His employer arranged the marriage to the daughter of a business associate. Ralph was 34. The woman was 19. Her name was Catherine. Ralph's diary entries about his marriage are brief and sad. June 12th, 1731. Married today. Catherine is sweet and kind and deserves better than me. August 3rd, 1731. C asked me why I do not touch her more. I had no answer. December 25th, 1731. Spent Christmas with C's family, everyone merry. I smiled until my face hurt, came home and wept. Ralph never went back to Benjamin's house, but he wrote about it. Years later, in 1740, he wrote this entry. I dreamed last night of B's house, the fiddle music and the laughter and the men in dresses. I dreamed of dancing with someone whose face I could not see but whose hand I could feel. I woke, and C was beside me, asleep, and I felt such crushing loneliness I could not breathe. I have everything a man is supposed to want. A wife, a good position, respect. And I would trade it all for one more night in that cramped room in Spitalfields, being myself. Ralph Thornton died in 1756. He was 59. He and Catherine had 3 children. The diary was passed down through the family as a curiosity. Great-great-grandfather's journal. No one read it closely until 1978. Benjamin Griffin's house closed in 1735. We don't know why. No raid, no arrest. Maybe Benjamin retired. Maybe he died. Maybe he just decided 8 years was long enough to push his luck. But for those 8 years, there was a Molly house in London that survived, where men could gather without being destroyed, where Ralph Thornton could dance with soldiers and Italians and men whose names he never learned. It mattered. It matters still. Let me tell you about the mock executions, because the Molly houses didn't just have weddings, they had funerals too. This comes from trial testimony. A constable named William Stevens testified in 1728 about a Molly house in Holborn, not Mother Clapp's, a different one. He described walking past the house and hearing sounds of wailing and lamentation. He looked through a window and saw what he thought was a funeral. A man was lying on the floor, covered with a white sheet. Other men stood around him, dressed in black, holding candles. Someone was reading from a prayer book. Someone else was weeping loudly. Stevens called for backup. They raided the house. When they burst in, the corpse sat up. It wasn't a real funeral. It was theatre. The man under the sheet, his name was Edward Collins, explained to the magistrate that they were performing a Molly funeral for a man who'd been arrested the week before. The man wasn't dead. He'd just been taken away. But to the Molly community, that was the same thing. Once you were arrested, you were gone. Dead to the community. So they mourned. The magistrate didn't care. Edward Collins and 12 other men were arrested for participating in sodomitical gatherings. Edward was sentenced to the pillory. He survived, but his left eye was permanently damaged from a thrown stone. But the Molly funerals continued. They were a way to grieve, a way to mark loss, a way to say, you mattered to us. You existed. We will not forget you. Sometimes the funerals were for men who'd actually died, men who'd been executed, men who'd died in prison, men who'd killed themselves. The community couldn't attend the real funerals, too dangerous, so they held their own, in Molly houses, in secret. They dressed in black or in rags. They covered mirrors, the way Jewish families do during Shiva. They read prayers, sometimes from real prayer books, sometimes made up. They spoke the dead man's name, his real name and his Molly name. They told stories about him, they cried, and then they drank. Because grief and joy were always mixed in the Molly houses. You mourned, and then you celebrated that you were still alive, still here, still together. The Society for the Reformation of Manners hated the Molly funerals almost as much as they hated the Molly weddings. They saw them as mockery of Christian rites, blasphemy, proof that the Mollys were not just sinners, but enemies of God. But the Mollys weren't mocking, they were surviving. They were creating rituals for a community that had no official recognition. No priest would bury a Molly with full rites. No church would hold a service. So the Mollys did it themselves. They took the scraps the world gave them and made something sacred. Now let me take you back to the cellar in Shoreditch, where you're living with Edward Courtney visiting every week. It's September 1726, 7 months since the raid. The air is getting colder. You can feel autumn coming. Edward arrives on a Thursday evening. He's brought bread, fresh bread from the bakery where he works. It's still warm. You tear it in half and eat together, sitting on your mattress. Edward tells you he's heard rumours of a new Molly house opening in Southwark. Not a public one like Mother Clapp's used to be. A private one. Invitation only. Run by a man neither of you know. You ask if he wants to go. He says he doesn't know. He's afraid. You're afraid too. But you're also lonely. The stolen hours with Edward are good. They're necessary, but they're not enough. You miss the community. You miss the laughter and the music. You miss being in a room full of men who understood. Edward says he'll think about it. You say you will too. He stays the night. It's the first time he's stayed the whole night. Usually he leaves before dark. But tonight he's too tired. Or maybe he just wants to stay. You lie beside each other in the dark. The cellar is cold. You pull the single thin blanket over both of you. Edward's body is warm against yours. You talk. Quiet voices. About nothing important. About the weather. About the price of coal. About a dog you saw in the street that reminded Edward of a dog he had as a child. And then Edward says something that breaks your heart. He says he wishes you could live together. Properly. Not stolen visits in a cellar. A real home. 2 rooms maybe. A fireplace, a table. A life. You say you wish that too. Edward says it's impossible. You say you know. And then you both stop talking because there's nothing left to say. The world is what it is. Wishing doesn't change it. You fall asleep like that, side by side. Edward's hand in yours. You wake up to pounding on the door. It's still dark. The middle of the night. The pounding is loud and insistent. Your landlord's voice. Open up! Constables! You and Edward sit up. Panic floods your body. This is it. This is the arrest you've been waiting for. Edward is already moving, pulling on his boots. You're frozen. The pounding continues. Open this door or we break it down. Edward grabs your arm. He pulls you to your feet. He whispers, "The window. Go." There's a window in the cellar, small, high up on the wall. It opens onto the street at ground level. You've never tried to climb through it. Edward boosts you up. You grab the window frame. It's stuck. You push. It opens. You pull yourself through. Your shoulders barely fit. You scrape your ribs on the frame. You fall onto the cobblestones outside. Behind you, you hear the door breaking, wood splintering, voices shouting. You run. You don't look back. You don't know if Edward got out. You don't know if he was caught. You just run. You run through Shoreditch, through Spitalfields, until your lungs burn and your legs give out. You collapse in an alley behind a chandler's shop. You sit in the dark, gasping, terrified. You wait for dawn. When the sky starts to lighten, you walk back toward the cellar. Carefully, staying in shadows. The cellar door is broken, hanging off its hinges. The room is empty. Your mattress is overturned. Your few belongings, a spare shirt, a needle and thread, a cup, scattered on the floor. No Edward, no constables, no note. You ask the landlord what happened. He won't look at you. He says constables came looking for a man named Edward Courtney. They had a warrant. They asked if anyone else was in the room. The landlord said no. The landlord lied. He saved you. You don't know why. Maybe he pitied you. Maybe he didn't want the trouble of another arrest. Maybe he just wanted you gone. He tells you to leave. Today. Now. He's not keeping a molly in his building. You understand. You gather your things. You leave. You never see Edward Courtney again. You try to find out what happened to him. You ask around, carefully, quietly. No one knows anything, or if they know, they won't say. You check the newspapers. No mention of an arrest. No trial notice. Nothing. Edward vanished. Maybe he was arrested and released. Maybe he left London. Maybe he died in Newgate and was buried in an unmarked grave like so many others. You don't know. You'll never know. And that not knowing is its own kind of torture. You find new lodgings. A room in Clerkenwell. More expensive than the cellar, but above ground. You work. You survive. You're alone. Months pass. Winter comes. You don't go to any molly houses. You don't look for community. You don't risk anything. You're 27 years old and you feel ancient. In January 1727, 1 year after the raid, you're walking through Smithfield Market when you see a man who looks like Edward. Same height, same build, same way of walking. Your heart stops. You follow him. He turns a corner. You rush to catch up. You round the corner and it's not Edward, just a stranger, a man who looks nothing like Edward now that you see him up close. The stranger stares at you. You realize you're crying. You walk away. That night, alone in your room, you let yourself remember. The first time you met Edward at Mother Clapp's. The first time you went upstairs together. The night he stayed and talked about wanting a real home. The morning you woke up to pounding on the door. You let yourself feel it. All of it. The love and the loss and the crushing unfairness of a world that won't let you exist. And then you make a decision. You're not going to live like this. Half alive. Always afraid. Always alone. You're going to find the new Molly house in Southwark. The one Edward mentioned. You're going to take the risk. Because Edward was right. A half-life isn't enough. You spend 2 weeks asking careful questions, listening to rumours, following threads. Finally, in late January 1727, a man you vaguely recognise from the old days, a former Mother Clapp's regular named Thomas Bell, pulls you aside in a tavern and gives you an address. Southwark, near the docks, Thursday nights. He also gives you a warning. It's smaller than Clapp's, maybe 15 men, and it's expensive, but it's safe, so far. You thank him. You memorise the address. On Thursday, you go. The house in Southwark is on a narrow street that smells of fish and tar from the docks. The buildings lean toward each other like conspirators. You knock on the door the way Thomas Bell told you. 3 times. Pause. Twice more. A slot opens. Eyes peer out. A voice asks, "Who sent you?" You give Thomas Bell's Molly name. Orange Thomas. The door opens. The man who opens it is older than you expected. Maybe 60. Grey hair, kind eyes, a face mapped with wrinkles. He introduces himself as Peter. Just Peter. No Molly name. No last name. You pay your shilling. He nods you inside. The room is smaller than Mother Clapp's main room was, maybe 10 feet by 12. There are 8 men already there, sitting on benches, standing by a small fire. No one is wearing dresses. No one is dancing. The atmosphere is different, quieter, more careful. But when the men look at you, you see recognition. Not of you specifically, most of them are strangers, but of what you are. A Molly, one of them. A younger man, maybe 22, with dark curly hair, offers you a cup of gin. You take it. He asks your name. You give your real name. He gives his. Robert. He's a printer's apprentice. He's been coming here for 3 months. You ask if it's safe. He shrugs. He says nowhere is safe, but this is safer than most. You talk to Robert for an hour. He tells you about the new Molly culture, how it's changed since the raids, how the houses are smaller now, more secretive, how the community is fractured. Some men left London entirely, some stopped going out altogether, some just got more careful. He tells you about a Molly house that operated in a boat on the Thames for 6 months. Men would row out to it after dark. It worked until someone informed and the boat was seized. He tells you about a group of Mollies who meet in a graveyard in Clerkenwell. They gather at midnight among the tombstones because no one patrols graveyards at night. It's morbid, but effective. He tells you that the Society for the Reformation of Manners is still active, still paying informers, still organising raids, but they're not as successful as they were in 1726. The Mollies learned. They adapted. You ask Robert if he's afraid. He says yes, all the time, but he's more afraid of being alone. You understand. Later, Peter, the older man who let you in, sits beside you. He asks if this is your first time here. You say yes. He nods. He says you have the look of someone who's been through something. You tell him about Mother Clapp's, about Edward, about the raid on your cellar. Peter listens. He doesn't interrupt. When you finish, he's quiet for a moment. Then he says, I knew Margaret Clapp before the raid. I used to go to her house sometimes. She was a good woman. She didn't have to do what she did. She had a family, a respectable life. But she saw that men needed a place, and she gave it to them. She paid for that with 2 years in prison and a ruined reputation. But she never said she regretted it, not once. You ask how he knows that. Peter says he visited her in Newgate. Once. He bribed a guard. He wanted to thank her. She told him not to thank her. She said she'd do it again if she could. Peter says, that's what I think about when I'm afraid. Margaret knew the risks. She did it anyway. And she'd do it again. So I keep this house open. Not for profit. I barely break even after bribing the local constable. I do it because someone has to. Because men need a place. Because the Society for the Reformation of Manners doesn't get to win. You feel something crack open in your chest. Relief, maybe. Or hope. You're not sure. You go back to Peter's house every Thursday for the next 2 years. You never see Edward again. But you meet other men. You have brief relationships. A coachman named Stephen who makes you laugh. A clerk named Francis who writes terrible poetry and reads it to you by candlelight. A soldier named James who's only in London for 3 months before his regiment ships out. None of them are Edward. But they're real. They're here. They see you. In 1729, Peter's house is raided. You're not there that night. You'd stayed home with a fever. The next day, you hear the news. 12 men arrested. Peter among them. You wait for Peter's trial. It happens in August 1729. The charge is keeping a disorderly house. The same charge Margaret Clapp faced. Peter is convicted. He's sentenced to the pillory and 18 months in prison. He's 63 years old. He survives the pillory but barely. A thrown stone breaks his jaw. He serves 8 months of his sentence before dying in Newgate of pneumonia in April 1730. His body is buried in a mass grave. No marker, no name, no mourners except the ones who couldn't come because it would mark them too. But you mourn. In your room in Clerkenwell, alone, you mourn. You think about Peter's kind eyes, his quiet determination, his belief that someone had to keep a place open. You think about Margaret Clapp, who would do it all again. You think about Edward, wherever he is. You think about William Griffin and Gabriel Lawrence and Thomas Wright, hanged at Tyburn. You think about the 16 men who stood in the pillory. You think about all the men whose names were never recorded. You think about the molly houses, those cramped, smoky, dangerous rooms where men could be themselves for a few stolen hours. And you make a decision. You're going to survive, not just exist, survive. You're going to keep going to the houses when you can find them. You're going to keep looking for community. You're going to keep being yourself even though the world wants you dead, because that's what they did. Margaret, Peter, Edward, all of them. They kept going. They kept existing. They refused to disappear. And you will too. You live to be 53 years old. You never marry. You work as a tailor your whole life. You live alone in a series of rented rooms across London. But you're not alone, not really. Over the years you find the houses. They move. They close. They open again somewhere else. You find them. You have lovers. Brief ones mostly. A bookbinder named Arthur, who you see on and off for 5 years. A teacher named William, who dies of smallpox in 1740. A merchant sailor named John, who you love deeply for 8 months until his ship goes down in a storm. You bury your heart a dozen times. It keeps beating anyway. In 1750, you're 49 years old and you hear about a new molly house in Holborn. You haven't been to a house in 2 years. You've been trying to be careful, trying to avoid risk now that you're older. But you go anyway. One more time. The house is run by a man named Samuel. He's young, maybe 30, and nervous. It's his first time running a house. There are only 6 men there the night you visit. One of them is Thomas Bell. Orange Thomas. The man who gave you the address for Peter's house 23 years ago. Thomas is in his 60s now. Grey hair, stooped shoulders. But his eyes light up when he sees you. You sit together by the fire. You talk about the old days, Mother Claps, the raid, the people you both knew who are gone now. Thomas tells you he's tired. He's been doing this, going to molly houses, hiding, surviving, for 40 years. He says he doesn't know how much longer he can keep going. You tell him you understand. You're tired too, but you're here. He's here, and that counts for something. Thomas asks if you think it will ever get better. If there will ever be a time when men like you don't have to hide. You say you don't know. You hope so. But you don't know. Thomas nods. He says, maybe we won't live to see it, but someone will. Someday. And they'll need to know we existed. They'll need to know we survived. They'll need to know we loved each other, even when the world wanted us dead. You say, then let's make sure they know. You and Thomas stay at that molly house until dawn. You talk about everyone you've lost. You say their names out loud. William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, Thomas Wright, Margaret Clapp, Peter, Edward Courtney. All of them. Every name you can remember, you bear witness. Because that's all you can do. Remember. Refuse to let them be forgotten. When you walk home through the London dawn, you think about the fact that you're still here. 49 years old, still alive, still yourself. The world tried to kill you. It killed so many others. But you're still here, and that's a victory. The historical record goes silent after 1750. We don't know when you died. We don't know where you're buried. Your name, if I gave you a real name instead of addressing you as you throughout this story, was never recorded in any document that survived. But you existed. You were real. You were a tailor in Georgian London who went to molly houses and loved other men and survived longer than you had any right to. And tonight, nearly 300 years later, someone is saying your story. I'm saying it. You're hearing it. That's what this was all for. Not the molly houses themselves. Those cramped rooms are long gone. burned or demolished or built over. Not the specific men. Most of their names are lost, their graves unmarked. It was for this moment, where we remember, where we refuse to let them be forgotten. The molly houses of Georgian London existed for barely 30 years in their most visible form, from roughly 1700 to 1730. After the 1726 raids, they never recovered their openness. They continued in secret, smaller and more hidden, for decades. But the culture, the visible, joyful, defiant culture, was destroyed. The Society for the Reformation of Manners believed they had won. They believed they had purged London of the molly menace. They were wrong, because you can't kill desire. You can't kill the human need for connection. You can raid the houses, arrest the men, execute the leaders. But the need remains. And where there's need, there will always be someone brave enough to meet it. The molly houses closed. New ones opened. Those closed too. More opened. In the 1740s and 50s, molly culture moved to public parks. Men met in Moorfields, in St. James's Park, in the alleys behind Covent Garden. They developed signals, a certain way of walking, a certain look, a red handkerchief in the back pocket, 100 years before that became a thing again in 1970s San Francisco. In the 1760s, molly houses reopened, this time called molly clubs, to sound more respectable. Private membership, strict vetting. They survived. In the 1780s, another wave of raids, more arrests, more executions. The cycle repeated, and it kept repeating. Through the 19th century, the 20th century. Different names. Molly houses became gay bars, became queer clubs. Different laws. The Buggery Act of 1533 became the Gross Indecency Laws of 1885 became Section 28 in 1988. But the pattern remained. Queer people created spaces. The authorities destroyed them. Queer people created new spaces. The cycle turned, until slowly, painfully slowly, the cycle started to break. The molly houses of 1726 are separated from us by nearly 300 years. None of the men who danced in Mother Clapp's house lived to see the 20th century. None of them could have imagined a world where men could legally marry each other, where pride parades fill city streets, where queer people can exist openly without constant fear of execution. But they would recognize the need that drives it all, the need to be seen, the need for community, the need to love and be loved without hiding. That need hasn't changed. We're still meeting it. We're still creating spaces, physical and digital, where queer people can be themselves. We're still doing what Margaret Clapp did, what Peter did, what every molly housekeeper and every regular customer did. We're still saying, you deserve a place. You deserve to exist. You are not alone. The line from Mother Clapp's house in 1726 to your local gay bar in 2024 is direct and unbroken. The spaces changed, the laws changed, the language changed. But the essential human act, creating a place where you can be yourself, that's the same. Every gay bar, every pride event, every queer bookshop or community centre or support group, every coming out story, every same-sex wedding, every quiet moment where two people of the same gender hold hands in public without fear. All of it traces back to the molly houses, to the men who risked everything for a few hours of joy, to Margaret Clapp sitting by her fire, keeping watch, to Peter bribing constables so 15 men could gather in safety, to the anonymous tailor in Clerkenwell who kept going, kept surviving, kept refusing to disappear. They didn't live to see the world change, but they changed it anyway, by existing, by insisting on their right to exist, by refusing to go quietly into the silence history demanded. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about them. Not with pity. They don't need pity. They need to be remembered as they were. Brave, funny, fierce, tender, human. Think about Margaret Clapp, who would do it all again. Think about William Griffin, 23 years old, hanged for love. Think about Edward Courtney, who wanted a real home and never got one. Think about Princess Seraphina in her tablecloth veil. Think about the anonymous man who wrote that letter. They have taken everything else from us. Do not let them take the memory. We haven't let them take the memory. The memory is here, in this video, in your mind as you fall asleep, in every archive and letter and trial transcript that survived. The Molly houses are gone. The buildings are demolished. The men are long dead. But we're still here, still creating spaces, still loving each other, still refusing to be silent. And that means they won, not the Society for the Reformation of Manners, not the executioners, not the men who threw stones at the pillory. The Mollys won, by surviving long enough to pass the torch, by creating a culture that couldn't be completely destroyed, by loving so fiercely that the evidence survived 300 years of people trying to erase it. Every time a young queer person comes out, the Mollys win. Every time a same-sex couple holds hands in public, the Mollys win. Every time someone says, I'm gay, or I'm queer, or I'm here and I deserve to exist, the Mollys win. Because they said it first, in Georgian London, in the Molly houses, in the face of execution and pillory and prison and erasure. They said, we are here, we exist, we love each other, and you cannot make us disappear. 300 years later, we're still saying it. And we're saying it for them, for every Molly whose name was lost, for every man who died in the pillory, for every woman who lived as a man because there was no other way, for everyone who stood in the dock and heard the sentence of death and faced it with dignity. We remember you. We honour you. We carry you forward. The Molly houses of Georgian London were small, cramped, temporary spaces, but they held something immense. The simple, radical act of existing, of loving, of refusing to be alone. That act echoes forward, through centuries, through continents, through every generation of queer people who looked around and said, there must be others like me, and then went looking, and found them. The finding is everything. The community is everything. The refusal to be isolated is everything. Margaret Clapp knew that. Peter knew that. The anonymous tailor knew that. They risked everything for it. And tonight, you and I, we get to have it without the same risk. We get to exist more openly than they could have imagined. We get to love without checking every shadow for constables. We get to say the words they couldn't say. We owe them that. Not guilt, not sorrow, just memory. Just the acknowledgement that we stand on their shoulders. That the freedom we have, incomplete, fragile, hard-won, was bought with their courage. So as you close your eyes tonight, in your clean bed, in your safe room, in a world where the Molly houses are museums and memories instead of death traps, say thank you to Margaret, to Peter, to Edward, to William and Gabriel and Thomas and all the rest. Thank you for existing. Thank you for refusing to disappear. Thank you for loving each other so fiercely that the evidence survived. Thank you for being brave when bravery meant death. We're still here because you were there first. We're still fighting because you fought first. We're still loving because you loved first. The Molly houses are gone. But the spirit that built them, the stubborn, beautiful, unbreakable insistence that queer people deserve to exist, that spirit is immortal. It lived in a cramped room on Field Lane in 1726. It lives in your heart right now. And it will live as long as there are people brave enough to say, I am here, I am queer, I am not alone. That's their legacy. That's what the Molly houses mean. Not the buildings, not the specific nights. The knowledge that it's possible, that community can be found, that love can survive even when the world tries to kill it. The Mollys proved it, and we prove it again. Every day, every generation, every person who comes out and finds their people and refuses to live in silence. The line is unbroken. From 1726 to right now. From Mother Clapp's house to wherever you are listening to this. From the Mollys to you, they pass the torch. We're still carrying it. And one day, we'll pass it forward too. To people who will live in a world we can't imagine. A world where the struggles we face today are history. Where the closets we're still fighting to escape are museum exhibits. those future people will look back at us the way we look back at the Mollies, with gratitude, with respect, with the knowledge that every generation fights the fight with the tools they have, and every generation brings us closer. The Mollies fought with gin and rented rooms and women's names and stolen hours. We fight with pride parades and marriage equality and legal protections and visibility. The future will fight with tools we haven't invented yet, but we're all fighting for the same thing. The same thing the Mollies wanted 300 years ago. The right to exist, the right to love, the right to gather without fear, the right to be ourselves. That right is not given, it's taken, inch by inch, generation by generation, death by death, and victory by victory, and ordinary Tuesday by ordinary Tuesday, where someone simply lives their truth and survives another day. The Mollies took their inches. We're taking ours. The future will take theirs. And the line will remain unbroken. So sleep well tonight, knowing you're part of that line, knowing that your existence, simply by being openly queer in a world that still has people who wish you weren't, is a victory the Mollies would recognize, would celebrate, would be proud of. You are their future. The future they couldn't see but kept believing in anyway. And you are not alone. You were never alone. You stand with the Mollies, with every generation of queer people who refuse to disappear, with everyone who will come after. The Molly houses of Georgian London were destroyed, but what they represented, the unbreakable human need for connection and love that can never be destroyed, it will outlive every law, every church, every moral panic, every society for the reformation of manners. Love outlives hate. Community outlives isolation. Existence outlives erasure. The Mollies knew that, in their bones, in their stolen hours, in the moment before the noose tightened or the stones flew. They knew they would die. But they also knew the love was real, and real things don't disappear just because people try to forget them. We remember, and in remembering, we keep them alive. William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, Thomas Wright, Margaret Clapp, Peter, Edward Courtney, Princess Seraphina, Kitty Cambrick, Orange Thomas. Every name we have and every name we lost. They lived, they loved, they mattered. And tonight, 300 years after they danced in a cramped room on Field Lane, they are not forgotten. That is the promise we make. The only promise that matters. To remember, to honour, to carry forward. The Molly houses are closed, but the doors they opened, to community, to love, to the possibility of living truthfully, those doors are still open. Walk through them. Find your people. Love fiercely. Exist loudly. Do it for yourself, but do it for them too. For everyone who couldn't. For everyone who tried and died trying. For everyone who loved in secret and died in silence. Live the life they couldn't have. Love the way they couldn't love. Be visible in the way they couldn't be visible. That's how we honour them. Not with sadness, with joy, with pride. With the fierce, unbreakable knowledge that we are here because they were there first. The Molly houses of Georgian London, 1726, Field Lane, a cramped room, a fiddle, gin, men in dresses, men holding hands, men kissing, men loving, men existing. For a few brief years they existed loudly. Then the raids came, the executions, the silence. But the silence didn't last, because we're still here, still talking, still remembering, still refusing to let them disappear into history's footnotes. Tonight on Gay Timeline, we turned back the clock to 1726 London. We walked into Mother Clapp's house. We met the men who danced there. We learned their names. We witnessed their courage. We mourned their deaths. And now we carry them forward, into tomorrow, into every tomorrow. Until the world they dreamed of, where love is simply love, and existence is simply existence, becomes real. They didn't live to see it, but we're building it for them. Brick by brick, law by law, life by life. That's what sleep should be tonight. Not escape, not forgetting, but rest. The rest that comes from knowing you're part of something larger. Something that began long before you and will continue long after. You are a link in an unbroken chain. From the Molly houses to right now. From the men who risked death for love to you, listening to their story, carrying their memory forward. That chain will never break. As long as we remember, as long as we tell the stories, as long as we refuse to let them be forgotten. Good night. Sleep well. And when you wake tomorrow, remember them. Remember that you are their dream made real, their impossible future come to life. You are what they died hoping would exist, and your existence, visible, unapologetic, free, is their victory. The Mollys of Georgian London, they lived, they loved, they mattered, and 300 years later we're still saying their names. William Griffin, Gabriel Lawrence, Thomas Wright, Margaret Clapp, Edward Courtney, and everyone whose name we lost. We say you existed too. We say you mattered too. We say you are not forgotten, not tonight, not ever. Good night, and sleep well.